I'll go ahead and get started. I do want to mention first, though, that this is sort of an experimental talk. It's about some stuff that I've been reading and really interested in lately. And in preparation for it, I amassed just like pages and pages and pages of notes. And then I had to distill it down into this. And so we'll see if I distilled it well. All this to say, very open to feedback, and I hope you get something out of it. We're going to talk about a few reasons that I think DeFi is really promising. And in particular, we're going to talk about reasons that I haven't heard people talk about so much before. So the bottom line here is that DeFi, or more broadly, new ground up financial system, allows for new approaches to economic thinking that in the traditional system and in academic economics can be very boxed out, pushed to the side because of entrenched ideologies within those institutions. So the questions I'm going to pose are, do new approaches to economic thinking have a place in the legacy system? And do they have a place in DeFi? And then we're going to talk a little bit about complexity economics, and we're going to talk about it for two reasons. The first and the most important reason is because it's a somewhat arbitrary example of a new approach to economic thinking that we see in DeFi and which is pushed to the periphery in academic economics. But then the second reason is I find it really interesting, and hopefully some of you do as well. Some of you do too. So with that, I will dive right into this giant wall of text you're about to see. Apologies in advance, but it's a really great quote that I think sets the stage nicely for these points I'm going to make. This is a quote from Yanis Varoufakis, who is the former finance minister of Greece, now writes quite a bit of really excellent content. This is neither here nor there, but a lot of stuffy old white men like to call him a bad boy, which I find just like really awkward and hilarious. So I put that on here. So the quote is, economics in universities began to evolve from the 1950s onwards as the queen of the social sciences. And what gave it discursive power and monopoly power within the academic environment was the claim that it was the only social theory which was peddling universal truths to be proven by mathematical means. And it succeeded. However, in order to close the model mathematically, the only way to solve the equations is by making assumptions that distance the model from what really exists in capitalism. So for instance, you have to assume that there is no time and there is no space, because if you allow time to interfere with your model or space to enter it, you end up with indeterminism. In other words, you end up with a system of equations that cannot be solved or that have an infinity of possible solutions. And then you have no predictive power. You can't say this is what's going to happen. So you have a very interesting inverse Darwinian process. The more successful economists were at creating models that said precisely nothing about capitalism, the greater their success in the academy. They create wonderful abstractions, aesthetically pleasing models that I spent quite a few years studying in the same way that you go to a museum and you look at a piece of abstract art. But you don't expect to find the truth of capitalism in its form. So I think this is an important quote because, first of all, it makes the point that I was trying to make, that academic economics can sometimes have a gatekeeping effect towards new ideas in economics. But also, it reflects the sort of abstractions that you find in academic economics, which sort of keep them from representing the reality of financial markets. So my argument here is going to be that complexity allows for more accurate models. But first, a couple of quick definitions. Economics, in the course of this talk, we're going to refer to as the study of how outcomes or structures in the economy derive from the behavior that produces them. And further, the definition of complexity we'll be working with is that elements in a system react to the pattern that the elements together create in a recursive way. So we'll talk a little bit more about, well, we'll talk a lot more actually about how this relates to economics, but from the beginning, that's the basic definition we're going to use. So back to the idea of particular abstractions keeping models from accurately reflecting the reality of markets. In standard economics, we have a few major assumptions. The first that we'll be talking about is the assumption that equilibrium is the natural state of markets. The second is that actors within those markets tend to act rationally. And the third is that all of the actors within those markets have equal access to information and that information can be spread throughout that market in a perfect or an uninterrupted kind of way. With complexity, we're going to assume pretty much the inverse of all of these things. Non-equilibrium or dynamism is really more the natural state of the economy. That actors within the economy can behave unpredictably and irrationally, sometimes, maybe all the time. And actors may know more or less than other actors. So just a quick spoiler. Oh, yeah, not quite the spoiler yet. To just dive into that a slight bit more, some words that can define standard economics in this context. We tend to see order. We see well-defined problems. Deductive rationality wins in most cases. Stasis, and there's no concept of time. It's pristine, it's pure, it's elegant, it's artificial. Complexity economics, we tend to see a lot of contingency. People will act in one way or another depending on the situation at large. There's indeterminacy. Our models can't necessarily predict exactly what's going to happen. All of the agents within the system are trying to make sense of the system that they're involved with all the time. So there's openness to change. There's path dependence, which means that small changes within the economy and also in the behavior of individual actors can make really large differences on the patterns that emerge from that system. So it's organic, it's algorithmic, and it's full of messy vitality. This all comes from Brian Arthur, who was a researcher at the Santa Fe Institute and one of the pioneers of applying complexity to the economy. There's just a ton of really interesting writing out there if you're interested in it, so that's a good place to start. So can we view markets as complex systems? I would say yes, for two major reasons, at least in the context of crypto. The first is that there's a fundamental uncertainty in everything we do. The agents within the system don't really know what they're facing, so they're always trying to understand the system that they're in. They're trying to explore the system that they're in, and they're constantly adapting to the changes that are happening within that system. And also, we can think of finance as really a collection of different technologies, right? We can think of that even before crypto, but especially in crypto now, that's particularly relevant. And technology is always changing at all times, at all levels of the system. So that keeps finance, and in particular, it keeps DeFi in a constant state of disruption. And that's really important, because if we remember that recursive definition with which we defined complexity, that leads to this situation where the particular actors within the system are constantly adapting to the system itself. The system is constantly changing because of that constant adaptation, and so the actors have to continue to adapt. So I'm going to go into some examples of complexity to try to explain why it's so, why I think it's really interesting in the context of crypto. But first, I want to give you a look at where we're going, because I don't want to just dive down a rabbit hole and expect you all to trust me that it might be relevant at some point. So the reason that it's relevant, I'm going to pull it back to Maker governance, and in particular, some of the stability fee issues that we had throughout the early parts of this year, and point out that in crypto, and particularly in Maker, we don't assume that crypto prices are converging towards an equilibrium. That would be ridiculous, right? Volatility is the natural state that we assume. We also don't assume that crypto traders act rationally necessarily. This is kind of a loaded statement because, of course, there's a ton of crypto that's based on game theory, which does assume some degree of rationality. But I'm not going to talk about that. That's kind of out of scope. And third, we don't really assume that crypto traders have the same level of knowledge, right? Especially people who are opening CDPs. It could be people who are experts about crypto. It could be people who are experts about finance. Or it could be people who just learned about crypto yesterday, and we're trying to appeal to all of these different ranges of expertise. And my argument is that makes a healthier system. So to move into some examples, I'm going to move pretty quickly through these, but they're pretty interesting, and they're good things to read into if you're interested in this topic. So the first set of examples that we're going to look at particularly focus on emergence, which is, I'll define it as an emergent pattern, or a pattern can appear when a number of simple agents operate in an environment, forming a more complex behavior as a collective. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and small changes on the agent level can translate to huge changes in the macro level patterns. So I'm going to show you some examples of this with cool GIFs. The classic example is traffic. Oops. Well, I guess the videos aren't going to play in the PDF version. That makes sense now that I'm thinking about it. So this is a cool video of traffic. I'll just kind of explain why traffic is an emergent pattern. So we have, traffic forms because individuals are driving their cars in particular ways with particular strategies for driving, and particular, like maybe they're in a rush, maybe they're not in a rush. And so we talk about traffic as if it's like a tangible thing, but it's really not. It's a pattern of behavior from the individuals. And just by understanding the individual's behavior, we can't exactly predict what traffic is going to look like. We can predict maybe certain things about like the volume of traffic or how long it might take you to get somewhere overall, but we can't predict that a traffic jam is going to happen in this time, in this place. Another example, this is so cool. I wish that you could see it. It's been going all over on Reddit lately, so look it up. But Ants are a really good example too. Like based on the simple rules that the individuals within ant colonies follow, you end up getting these extraordinary patterns forming among ants that, you know, in certain cases they like farm fungi. In other cases, like in this video, there's some really cool footage of them like forming together in a clump, and this guy like picks it up and drops it, and it's really creepy, and it would have given you all nightmares, but like in a good way. So just look it up. It's pretty cool. So emergence, we'll come back to why that's important, especially in terms of markets. But the main point is that if the economy is a complex system, the markets that form from it emerge in this way, right? We can't really predict how markets are going to behave just by looking at the individual's behavior within that market. We can predict certain things about it, but we can't really predict when the booms are going to happen, when the busts are going to happen, and to what degree. So the second category of examples I want to point out really quickly is how this translates to like analyzing the data within markets and within other, you know, complex systems. So generally this falls under the umbrella of what's called agent-based modeling, which is an approach to computational modeling that focuses on the diversity and dynamism of the agents within that system, rather than solely focusing on the macro patterns of the system. So what that means, as we'll see in this example, is if we were to model what the stock market might look like given certain conditions, certain price conditions, that sort of thing, we can get a general idea of the shape of market movement, but we can't see with any degree of granularity where the spikes are really going to happen. So this is a really cool example that actually was done by that same guy I quoted earlier, Brian Arthur, in the Santa Fe Institute, originally in like 1988, but it's continued to be updated over the years. And just for a quick tour of what's going on here, the top line is a normal model based on neoclassical economics, and the bottom line is agent-based models. So the way that they do that is just from a very high level, they'll program in certain expectations of individuals' behaviors. And they'll also give them memories to some degree of how other agents within that system are acting and how the system has responded to certain exogenous events. So you'll see actually that they follow a pretty similar pattern. And I listened to a talk from Brian Arthur when he was delivering this data, and he said his first impression was like, well, damn, like this whole thing isn't that different from standard economics after all. But then you start to look at it a little closer and you see that actually in some critical places there are some differences. Like right here in particular, you can see that it follows the same general shape. So you might be able, using standard economic models, to say there will be a dip in the market sometime around here. But what you don't see is the extent of the dip, which does become clear with this agent-based model. And of course, that's important in markets because that's where all the money's made. That's where all the interesting stuff is happening. If everything stayed gradual and at equilibrium, then no trading behavior would happen, and DAI wouldn't work, and all sorts of things that we don't really want to happen. So volatility isn't such a bad thing in these cases. The second example is, I'm going to rush through this. There's a lot that could be said about it, but this is an example of the prisoner's dilemma game in game theory, which is run for 70,000 or so iterations. And it's designed as an agent-based model. You see here the 0 1s and eventually lots of 1s and 0s. These represent the memories of the agents in terms of what strategies their opponents are using, how those are changing, and how the system changes in response to it. And so what you might expect to see after a certain amount of time is that a certain strategy would win out. You might think that, especially in the prisoner's dilemma, there aren't that many strategies you can use. But in fact, what you see is really a vibrant ecology that alternates between stasis and dynamism, and various strategies will react to other strategies gaining prominence and mutate based on that. They'll learn how to take advantage of other player strategies in such a way that you don't really see a rational outcome here. And in fact, this doesn't stop because it reached some sort of equilibrium. It just stopped because that was the end of the experiment arbitrarily. So I will put a bookmark here because I don't know why it did that. I think there's a lot to be said about how complexity and game theory meet, especially in terms of like consensus algorithms and stuff like that. But I don't have a lot of time, and that would take up a lot more time than even I had in the beginning. So if you're interested in talking about that, though, it's something I'm really interested in lately. So we'll move out of these examples and try to bring it together. To me, complexity is an example of a reasonable approach to economic thinking that gets pushed to the periphery by entrenched ideologies. And it's actually very strange that it does, because complexity as a viewpoint is something that's very natural. It's something that borrows a lot of intuitive logic from like nature right? Ants was a good example. Traffic is something that comes somewhat naturally. And so it makes sense to a lot of people intuitively. And the only reason really that it isn't a part of standard academic economics is because we lacked the computational power to make effective agent-based models until the last few decades, really. So just as proof of that, here's a quote from Adam Smith, where he says, its agents, banks, consumers, producers, governments, react to the aggregate outcome those agents together create. This is essentially talking about complexity. And not just Adam Smith, but you find similar quotes from people like John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, like people who the academy really considers like the essential academic thinkers were talking about this. So I think it's a perfect example of like a pretty non-subversive economic idea that really should be a part of how people view markets and model those markets. But because of how rigid academic economics can be, it still gets pushed off to the side, and it's still sort of a niche interest. So now we'll talk about why that's important to DeFi. So these limitations, like the entrenched ideologies that prevent new ideas from becoming part of the mainstream, they just don't exist in DeFi. And I do want to mention that that's not necessarily specific to DeFi. It's not specific to Ethereum. What it is specific to is a new ground-up way of thinking about economics. And that's something that I think is really important that's happening here. So I will tell you why that's important, and I'll also tell you why how it's actually happening like in real life right now. So as I mentioned before, Maker governance does not assume that crypto prices are going to be reaching any sort of equilibrium at any point. We don't assume that people who have CDPs are acting rationally, and when they see the rate go up, are going to close at a certain point. And we don't assume that our CDP holders are even aware that these rate changes are happening necessarily. We don't assume that the mediums or the media that we publish these changes on are reaching everybody. And this leads to tighter iterations on governance, and it also leads to more adaptive approaches to setting these rates. And I think that's really important. Because at the very least, the last 10 years have given us reason to think critically about how we might improve the system, the way that monetary policy is set, and the way that we depend on, a few individuals to set that policy in omnipotent sorts of ways. And I'm not trying to be obnoxiously skeptical of central banks or anything, but I do think that it is relevant to maybe take a new approach, try something out. This is a fairly contained experiment, and I think it's very healthy. So I guess I just talked about some of this stuff, but it also creates an uninterrupted feedback loop between markets and the people who are governing those markets. And critically, you see that that's really not the case in modern central banking, right? Even when forward guidance like notes are dropped that maybe rates are going to raise eventually in the future, it causes all sorts of infighting among people in financial markets. It causes infighting in political environments now too. And it really, at every step of the way, interrupts the feedback between markets and the monetary policy that's governing those markets. And if we are to view the economy as a complex system, the healthiest way it can possibly develop is organically, which means an uninterrupted feedback loop that's allowed to self-organize in whatever way it might. And I'll explain why that's important here. So right now, we see DeFi as sort of traditional financial instruments and institutions being to some degree ported over onto the blockchain. But if this is a complex system, and if we do see self-organizing structures emerge from it, I would say what we can expect is to see more and more truly novel things coming out of it. Novel institutions, novel instruments, novel ways of doing things that aren't just copying the way that financial markets work today. And I think that's really important because the more distinct it becomes and the more unique it becomes, the more of an effective hedge it becomes on the inherent financial risk in the traditional system. And to that end, to me, if we create a distinct option which both retains the standard crypto value adds like financial inclusion and also becomes a workable financial market with accessible credit that can set its rates appropriately with tighter iterations and adapts to new technologies effectively, we don't really need this to eclipse traditional finance, right? In fact, it might be kind of an apocalyptic situation if that all came crashing down. So what I really want to stress here is that for DeFi to be successful, it doesn't need to take over the financial world. It just needs to keep developing as it is, and we need to keep letting whatever comes out of it come out of it, which doesn't mean we should be cavalier about governance or anything, but it does mean that, maybe we're setting the bar a little high when we're thinking about taking over the entire financial world in the short term. And the reason that's important is I think there's a lot of really incredible things that we're doing already, right? Maybe there's not a lot of people in Argentina that can use DAI, but there are some, and if some people get some value out of it in a stressful time, it's already a really good thing, right? So maybe over the next few years, more and more people can use it, and that's really great, I think. So that was a GIF. It was a funny GIF. Now it's just a weird screenshot, but to sum it all up, new approaches to finance might be the only way, really, to incorporate new ideas and economic thinking into real monetary policy and into general practice. As I mentioned before, that's not specific to DeFi. It's specific to a new approach in general, but I think the most promising new approaches to finance are happening here in DeFi. I'm biased because I work at Maker, but I also think that, objectively, an appreciation of complexity has enabled better and more adaptive approaches to monetary policy, I guess you could call it that, in the case of restoring the DAI peg. And as novel economic structures, financial institutions, and financial instruments emerge, DeFi will continue to become a better hedge for the systemic risk inherent in the legacy system. I know that it was kind of in the title that I was going to talk about that systemic risk, and I ran out of time, so sorry. I guess that's the subject for another talk, but like I said before, I'm very interested in talking about these things offline too, so feel free to start a conversation with me about any of that stuff. So that's pretty much it. Reach out if you'd like to. That's my Twitter handle. I just stupidly joined Twitter 2 weeks ago. I'm really behind, but so that's my Twitter. And you can email me too if you're late to the party like I was. Yeah, I don't know. Do I have any time for questions or?
I think we can give Ethan a round of applause to start with.
Thanks.
I counted 23 things. We've got time for one question if there's someone who... there we go, hand up.
Chris Powers, just interested in DeFi stuff. Really interesting talk. I really think it's cool to be bringing these ideas into this space. And I think there's a lot of just natural experimentation that gets to happen in DeFi and play these out. I guess starting with the beginning, when you're talking about complexity theory and basically the failure of economic models, it kind of seemed like then you're basically trying to model irrational behavior, which kind of, doesn't really make sense. And I guess when I think of how investors react in the world or users react in the world, it's not so much oh, we are acting rationally to some weird event, or oh, there's some upper bound or lower bound. Oftentimes those decisions are based on this thing called judgment, right? And I don't know, I guess this is a fool's errand to try to model judgment in a lot of ways, because judgment is our gut feel, right? It's these things that we know aren't rational, but they do affect us. And so I just kind of curious to how you kind of square that and whether, So.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it's a pretty common criticism of both complexity and especially emergence, to the extent that I had a funny sound effect I thought about playing every time I said the word emergence, because it's magical. People kind of treat it like it solves everything. But I think it's mostly important as a counterbalance against full trust in models that assume that rationality. So we might not be able to say this like judgment's a great word for it. We might not be able to say that a person's judgment is going to be here or there on a particular day, but what we can start to do potentially is start to figure out like what the bounds, like what reasonable variance we can set on those models to sort of temper our expectations that we get from those models. Does that answer your question? Right. And I think even from a less quantitative perspective, the reason why maker governance is a good example, I think, is because we have calls every single week to talk about raising the fee or keeping the fee stable. And basically none of these things are taken for granted there. So you hear a lot of conversations about like, okay, if everybody is rational, then this rate should deter people from opening CDPs, maybe cause people to close them. But we don't really know. So let's raise it and let's come back next week and let's see what happened. And I think that that's a much healthier approach.